Good evening and welcome to the 2024 Evening Lecture Series co-sponsored by the Belfast Garden Club and the Belfast Free Library. Together, we are pleased to bring you tonight's program, Gardens for Resilience with Irene Barber from Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens. Excuse me. I am Brenda Harrington, Program Librarian at the Belfast Free Library, and I want to thank you all for joining us. Tonight's presentation is the second in our series of 3 evening programs that will focus on new approaches to garden design for resiliency and conservation. I'm joined tonight by Belfast Garden Club Program Committee member Hilary Harston. Before I turn the mic over to Hilary, who will mention the additional programs and introduce our speaker, I want to let you know that tonight's program is being recorded and will be available on the library's YouTube channel, which you may access from our website, belfastlibrary.org. During the presentation tonight, please keep your mic muted and type any questions into the chat, and I will read them during the Q&A at the end. With that, I will turn the mic over to Hilary. Thank you, Hilary.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm happy to introduce Irene Barber of Durham, Maine. Irene has degrees in plant and soil science, as well as communications and human behavior. She runs many classes at the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens and is a registered professional horticultural therapist. Welcome back to Belfast, Irene.
Wow, thank you so much. Yeah. I'm so grateful to be here once again. Brenda and I were just reminiscing. I think it's been at least maybe 12, maybe more years since I was at the Belfast Free Library. So, and yes, I work at Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens managing adult education programs and have been designing landscapes myself since about 2006. And have been really in the soil, working in the soil since I was age 15. It's been a love of mine that I never really thought would become a profession. But here I am finding fulfillment in what I take so much joy in, and I actually get compensated for. So the best of both worlds. So I wanted to focus our talk on the aspect of gardens and what that means. Is it garden design or gardening? So we just encapsulated gardens for resilience, and it's highlighting your practices as well as your designing. And so we'll continue on here. So what is the importance of gardening for resilience? So a few years ago, or actually 2 years ago, we wrote a blog, my editor and myself at the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens wrote a blog of what this meant. And so you can even go back to our website and see this information in more detail if you wish. So this is some of the content of what gardening for resilience relates to. It relates to and consists of sustainability and embraces regeneration. So regeneration is just the concept of how plants will return and become something, you know, even more impactful and powerful, even under the subsequent storms that we're experiencing or the drought periods that we're experiencing. If we plant and design and sustain our soils in an appropriate manner, and we're setting ourselves up and our landscapes up for success and regeneration. So with these crazy weather patterns, and some of you probably were impacted by the storms in January, there are many things like this that we have to continue to face progressively throughout the years ahead. And so why we want to reduce the concept of conventional traditional design and embrace more of an ecological approach and an approach of resilience will enable our landscapes to be that much more prepared in those challenging weather patterns of drought, of too much rain, of wind, and ice. Gosh knows, we all seem to get that November, early December ice storm nowadays. And so we have to think about what are going to be the plants and what are going to be the materials that we're going to use that can withstand those situations. So most importantly is diversity. We really need to focus on diversity of plants. And so maybe one year a plant type that would grow really well in a drought condition, but then the next year in that same garden that had that thrived in the drought, but now it's too rainy. We want to integrate actually our dry and our wet plants in a system where they are actually responding and effectively producing aesthetic garden spaces in those given periods of drought or wet conditions. With that said, I'm not saying plant wetland plants next to Perovskia, Russian sage, but we certainly want to appeal to versatility in our garden designing. So another aspect of practicing for resilience is focusing on no-till. So I'm going to go into more practices first, and then we'll discuss a little more design. But no-till is reducing, if not preventing, carbon release. So you've probably heard the term carbon sequestration, and it is a real thing, and we want to empower our soil health to become that sponge, to become that bank for carbon to be trapped. And rather than, if we continue to till and continue to till, we're actually releasing more carbon, and we're ruining our soil structure. So we really want to preserve our soil tilth and health by doing limited amounts of no-till, if not any till. And by doing so, by the way, when you practice no-till, you are also reducing the regeneration of unwanted weed seeds or undesirable plants, as I like to call it. A weed is only a plant that's in the wrong place or what is not intended for. But honestly, a lot of our quote unquote weeds are magical plants that, Mother Nature produces for us just to cover the soil. But in any case, if you do over-till or continue to till, you bring these undesirable seeds back to the surface and germination, and then you have a competition of your desirables and your undesirables in the same space. So a method of no-till is really called lasagna gardening or layered gardening. And this is just an image to capture what that is. And that's basically taking a lot of your composting materials or what you would use for composting and put them into an actual living garden space or functional garden space instead of putting it into a bin. You can compost within this vegetable garden setting. So it's taking advantage of your pine needles, your straw, perhaps, your grass clippings, newspaper waste, twigs, believe it or not, thin decaying twigs, leaf mold, or any leaves for that matter, and putting them in layers, as you can see here, from the lowest layer to the top layer. You are now producing a vegetable bed or garden bed. It doesn't have to be with just vegetables. It can be with any kinds of plants, really. But they will then build up, and so that you're not having to dig down into maybe even malnourished soils or compacted soils, and so you're taking advantage of growing upwards and increasing infiltration and positive organic material into your growing horizons. So earth soil is intended to be covered. It's not supposed to be exposed like Death Valley, which, by the way, I can't believe was a lake the other day. But anyways, exposed surfaces or exposed soil leads to depletion and death of life and death of the soil. So we need to protect our soil in order for the living microorganisms or the living components in the soil to stay vibrant and to stay effective and efficient for us. So by doing so, if you do ever need to remove vegetables or remove plants from your soil and you're not quite sure what to plant in place right away, put down a cover crop or green manure. And this can be a mixture of oats and barley and vetch and clover, etc. and then it can be overwintered and then tilled in, lightly tilled in, or even just mowed down, and then you plant directly into that with your next stage of plants. There are techniques of cover cropping that can be done in very small spaces, but they can also be done in the traditional farming setting. But we're trying to identify that cover crops have a purpose in even the smallest urban experiences. This is a diagram of what's called horticulture. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. This is a man named by the name of Hugel, and he coined the term horticulture and he's from Germany. And this is basically planting a berm into on your property, or building a berm onto your property and planting directly into it. And this berm is of the same material that you use in lasagna gardening, but in a composited and log-like system. So it basically is like the Bûche de Noël with plants in it and living. And you can actually increase plant vigor and plant production yielding times because you're going up higher, so it's heating up faster. It also increases, as I said, permeability, porosity, but while the fact that there's good fungal properties and bacteria and all these good sponges of materials in there, it won't dry out as much as you may think. Another practice of no-till is called sheet mulching. So essentially you would cover over the grass that you've got, or some kind of undesirable ground cover, and you cover with wetted down newspaper or cardboard, depending on the rate of decomposition that you want to encourage. And it's not just one ply of newspaper, it's usually about 3 to 7 plies of newspaper, but you wet it down, and then you can either just put some mulch down over that just for a mulching purpose, or you can actually then put another bit of compost and your lasagna gardening over that, and then plant directly. And so whatever's from beneath doesn't actually come up through that material. Cardboard is nice only because it reduces any potential re-immersion from beneath. So if you have some aggressive, like tap-rooted plants like burdock or mullins or something like that, you can just cut them down and then put the cardboard down, and preferably no plastic or preservatives or tape on the cardboard. You have to peel that off, but wetting it down will help settle it and get it started in that decomposition process. And this is a much better method than using landscape fabric, because only landscape fabric, it won't decompose, and whenever weeds grow up through it, it's such a nuisance to try to plant or remove out of that. Leaf mold is a wonderful material and underused, and we can make that so easily, even more easily than composting. So we all have an abundance of leaves and needles in our landscape. And so if we can compile certain sections or reserve certain areas of our property, put those leaf piles in those areas, and then over time, start taking from beneath the pile, that is your gold right there, your black gold, with lots of mycelium, good beneficial fungi, and that are going to be the humus material that a lot of our native plants in particular appreciate. Any plant will grow in it, but native plants really don't, in New England, they don't really want to have really extra rich fertile soils. They prefer to have a leaner diet. And humus, all that's doing is it's helping with soil structure. It's not necessarily giving lots of nutrients as much as a compost perhaps would. So another approach to gardening for resilience, or garden designing for resilience, is now in particular this time of year. If you hadn't already done it in the summer or the fall before now, do it now. Record your observations that you had made during the growing season. Recall, and if anything, look back in photos that you may have taken in your garden. and start to really document down what did really well, what didn't do well, what were the months of rain or the weeks of rain even, or the drought periods, etc. And so you start to understand the cycle of how the plants are actually responding to the environmental factors. Was there ample amounts of rain this year? Yes, there was, definitely. Year before, not so much. You start to have kind of a sequence of seasons, and then you relate to how the plants were performing that year. And then you determine, well, you know, this area seems to be getting more inundated with rain on a constant basis, or it's flooding. What do I do to address that, or to mitigate, or maybe help absorb that moisture that's starting to become much more of a problem these days? So also I want you to document your successes. What were some challenges that you've experienced? Maybe just sketch out and make some doodle marks. It's not actually doing artistic designing here. We just need to provide some visual reference for yourselves. And then think about your habitat. How was the wildlife interacting with your landscape that year or this year? And in essence, we do want to, it's funny, Brenda, Hillary, and I were talking about a presenter identifying how to prevent wildlife damage, and then another presenter saying, oh, encourage wildlife. And there is such a thing as managing with wildlife and living harmoniously as much as possible with wildlife, and actually embrace it as much as possible with this purview or this understanding of your plant selection and of your practices and your spatial arrangements of plants that will either deter or attract your wildlife, depending on your goals. So we as humans are not separate from nature, by the way. We are part of nature. We are part of this equation. And although we have done so much harm to nature, we have to recalibrate and understand that we are part of this equation, and that's including wildlife. We need to understand how to coordinate, and if anything, I encourage you to learn about wildlife habits, not just habitat, but habits, and then determine how you can work with it rather than against it. And in doing so, remember how planting diverse plant combinations is going to not only support the regeneration during, variable seasonal patterns, but it also will help with biodiversity and create a balance of the wants that you want, and those wants, such as the good insects, will help the predators to the bad insects, or maybe get those raptors into your landscape. I don't know if any of you have seen that movie, that documentary, the biggest little farm, or something of that nature. I can't remember. Maybe put it in the chat box. I probably butchered the title. It's about bringing in the ecological system to be the manager of your landscape. So instead of you seeing yourself as the manager, you're actually part of it. You're not the key stakeholder in managing your landscape. It's bringing in these bird species that will help mitigate your vole and your mold damage, or too many chipmunks perhaps. So getting in those raptors and other animals of prey that will help keep other animals in check. It's just the balance of our food chain, which we are definitely needing to reconstitute, reintroduce. The plant communities are what I referred to back in the beginning, is having some plants that can tolerate the moisture, having some plants that tolerate the drought, and live and working with them in these seasonal displays, and also not just seasonal, but in those weather patterns, and realizing one year may be better than the other for certain species. But when they can be together, mixed in together, then you'll see how the landscape will evolve and perform differently year by year by year. So dare to broaden your plant palette, in particular your native plant palette. Try to understand and kind of calibrate also your idea of beauty. Beauty is not cleanliness. Beauty is about the whole systems approach in a landscape. So the opportunity of seeing seed heads of your senna plant or the seed heads of the solidago goldenrod. By the way, just to remember, goldenrod does not cause that allergy that ragweed does. So we want to break that rumor if you haven't already heard so. But solidago is goldenrod is one of the most important species for our late season pollinators, along with our New England aster. So we want to embrace different types of solidagos because they all perform a little differently. Some are less aggressive than others. Some are more aggressive than others. Same thing with asters. Same thing with any plant genus. It's not just the genus that qualifies the plant behavior. It's actually going to be the species. So remember how there's a chance to learn about not only the genus, but also the species in order to make your plant conclusion or your plant selection of knowing what plant is the right plant for that right place. And in combination with its neighbors, with the plant's neighbors, who does it live with? And instead of seeing plantings as big, organized swaths of one type, we are going to work within a mixed plant community, so it feels more of a impressionistic painting, as I like to refer to. So that's where I'm going with here. So you can have mixes to be a little more formal, or you can have them to be a little more wild. So formal on the left, where things are a little bit more defined in layers, whereas on the right, everything is kind of at the same height and there's lots of whim and movement and not so much definition from one plant to another, aside from perhaps the flowers at the time at which it's blooming, or the formulation, or not formulation, but the arrangement of the foliage and the shape of the foliage. But honestly, like, you can have a naturalistic kind of garden and a resilient garden be in a formal context. It's just learning about plant behaviors and integrating their companions with each other. So I don't know if any of you follow arts and crafts at all, but honestly, there's an arts and crafts movement in landscape design, and that was around the same period of the arts and crafts of Frank Lloyd Wright. But plant form for function. Form for function is key. That goes into the constitution of what is beauty or beautiful, okay? When plants can perform in a functional state as much as in a state of aesthetics, that is true beauty. And I don't know if any of you have been to the Wild Gardens of Acadia, but I strongly recommend it. That's the essence of taking advantage of our native plants and seeing how they're composed with each other and understanding what can be utilized in an ornamental and even almost stylistic gardening approach. In this left-hand picture, this is a shrub oak, one of our native shrub oaks. It's not one that gets enormous. It stays nice and low. It has some ruggedness and jaggedness, and it now can become almost like a topiary or a bonsai type of tree that you would see in Japanese gardens. And just, we actually in Maine and New England have a lot of essence of what Asian landscapes are like, and we can integrate some of that style that maybe some of you really love with the minimalism, but with the point that minimalism is only so far in nature. Nature doesn't really love minimalism. But think about plant habits for their function. If they're going to be spreading plants and if they're going to be fast growing plants, then they're going to be really supportive to erosion control. And always remember to plant in layers. That's another aspect of resilience. Never plant on just one plane or one horizon. Really integrate layers within several feet of one plant to another, so that you're creating a ground cover layer, a shrub layer, an understory layer, and then an upper story layer. So 3 to 4 layers. Here's some plants that may be of interest to you that aren't necessarily used all that much. And on the left-hand side, this is Verbena hastata. This actually blooms and grows, I should say, in culverts in ditches. It tolerates road salt and it loves moisture, and it blooms in August through September, mid-August to early September thereabouts. And it has this, it's one of our native verbenas. We think of verbenas as only annuals, those creepy crawly plants, or the Verbena bonariensis that is that nice meadowy scape kind of plant, but that's an annual and not native. This is one of our native ones, and it looks similar to Veronica or Speedwell. On the other side of wet is our Asclepias tuberosa. This is known as butterfly weed, not to be mistaken with butterfly bush, okay? Totally different plants. And this is a butterfly weed that is native to the Northeast. And there are yellow forms as well, but these are plants that also respond much better to being sown, not planted from a pot into the ground. They result really well in either the plugs, maybe small little seedlings that you've started from seed, or you bought from somebody who started them from seed, or you sow them yourself in November, dormant sowing. That is an action of gardening for resilience, is growing plants from seed, and I'll get into that some more. Monarda punctata, spotted bee balm. This is a wonderful pollinator and also grows in very drought conditions. So butterfly weed loves very dry, xeric environments, would grow really well with the sundial lupin, which is the true native lupin. Whereas on the opposite side, the Verbena hastata would prefer moist. It doesn't have to be wet all the time. It definitely needs to have that spring moisture for it to really germinate and start producing the basal foliage before it starts to flower in the later season when it could be drier out. Remember to landscape or garden for not only for yourselves, but for wildlife. And this is an example right here of gardening for wildlife and gardening for resilience, in that fact that you are producing a sense of balance. So there are going to be birds who want your plants, and there's going to be chipmunks who want your plants. But if you plant in abundance and with the variety of these fruiting plants, then they're never going to wipe you out completely of one specific species, okay? So be sure to provide variety and diversity and an abundance of what you can of edibles, and you'll see that you will have the enjoyment of the fruits as much as the wildlife will have the enjoyment. Plus, I love these kinds of plants, by the way, because of their fall color. Oh my gosh, their fall color and their nutritional aspects. And instead of foraging for these native plants and removing that forage from the native wildlife, how about growing it on your landscape and increasing the amount of, so that you don't have to compete with perhaps what's already out there in the wildlife area. And instead of robbing, we've just robbed from wildlife all too much already. Let's give back a little bit. Let's give them some of their spaces and preserve that. So planting and health strips. This is a fun approach to landscaping for resilience. And it's not easy in New England, I will tell you. So this is, some of you may recognize this. This is in front of the Farnsworth Museum. And this deals with a lot of salt. And I do work with a landscape company and try to integrate the practices. So putting pine boughs or balsam boughs down before the onset of the winter really comes on heavy on us. Those balsam boughs will help resist the accumulation of the salt into the beds, as well as it preserves the plants from waking up too early and then all of a sudden a cold snap hits, because we're in an urban heat effect here. It will wake up early in the spring and early actually February, and the plants will start coming out they'll start emerging, and then all of a sudden we get a cold snap. So if you put in that insulation of balsam boughs or pine boughs, or even just leaf mulch, it will help reduce the stresses of the salt and the premature heat up. And that landscape, by the way, was grown from plugs that were planted in June, and then the following August, on the right-hand side, you can start to see how things were starting to already fill in. So planting from plugs are a really economical way, and you can really start talking to your landscape companies or your nurseries, say, hey, are you ever selling from plugs? I will say a lot of native plant nurseries are doing that, and the smaller scales are doing that. It's harder for some of the big scales to do that, but big scale nurseries. Here's an example of when planting in a burlap situation is going to be against your idea of what you wanted. So balled and burlap is a very challenging planting method or replanting method. And yes, you get a big size of a plant, a tree initially, but the compromise is that you will have to irrigate so much more than if you bought a potted plant or potted tree, and the potential for the plant to not even acclimate to the setting and even be appropriate to the soil depth. So this is a situation where the landscape company was determined to plant these larger trees, and yet they didn't have the soil depth. So then they created these little volcanoes, and look what the volcano shape is. It's just going to make water erode down and never absorb the water. So now the bottom of in the interior of the fir tree is showing all this yellowing because it's drying out. So the tree is under substantial amount of stress. And if we planted plants at a smaller size, even trees, they will acclimate to their setting so much better than if they were transplanted in a very large size. And you make some of those determinations based off of plant rate of growth as well. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But growing from seed will prove to spread and cover ground so much more effectively than planting in pots right away. Planting in seed, especially when you can do dormant seeding, following season, it will become this wonderful little grassy or fern meadowy, New England meadowy kind of a landscape. Also, growing from seed ensures genetic diversity. And genetic diversity basically is identifying how not one plant is the same as the other. And it allows for a stronger, more versatile and diverse plant world out there that can hold up to the stressors that we're going through right now, and that they can produce a diet for wildlife to even be that much more healthy in the long run. Resilience also refers to growing in succession. So you can't expect that a landscape is done or a garden is done and implemented in one season. Think of your landscape as a living organism that is evolving, okay? And so maybe for 3 years, it's going to be a grassy setting, and then maybe beyond that, it will be a woodland, and so on and so forth. So it continues to evolve. With that in mind, yes, you can expect a garden or set up a design that will, of plant combinations that will include succession, but maybe not into a forest, but certainly including the fact that there's going to be some changes of the landscape, especially with our weather patterns changing. Here are two examples of very heavily planted settings and how a number of the smaller growing or shorter lived species are going to basically be treated as temporary plants. They're interim plants. They're there to cover and produce and provide aesthetics, produce habitat and floral arranging or, aesthetics. Then over time, they will wean away, and then the more dominant species will take over. With that in mind, you want to think about how you still want to sustain diversity. So think about maybe some of those more aggressive plants be the smaller quantity of the plant combinations, and the less aggressive plants to actually be dominant species, and that way they have a foothold against the more aggressive types. One other thing is just try not to cut back in the fall. Resist as much as possible. If you had to do some cutback, here are some options. Partially cut back 18 inches high. So if you don't want a tall grass or a tall perennial to flop over and be in your snow blowing path or whatever, or your shoveling path, because it will have to topple over from the snow load and everything, and cut it maybe 18 inches so that 18 inches is still above ground, and that 18 inches can pretty much stay stabilized. And then that is habitat for our overwintering insects, even into the following year, especially with our species of plants that have a lot of pith in them. So something like Joe Pye weed or butterfly weed, for instance, or even milkweed. Those plants have a very stabilized kind of fibrous stem that becomes a hollow pith, and then our winter insects, our native insects overwinter in there, and not just for the first year, but even for the second year. If you can't sustain those stems, then alternatively take your cuttings and pile them into kind of a pyramid shape somewhere adjacent to where you were or where you've cut them, and then that can be the habitat for the following year or for that winter. So remember, I said embrace the insects because there are the good ones as much as there are the bad ones, but you can't have the good ones if the bad ones don't exist, because the good ones are oftentimes the predators for the bad ones, or what we think are bad. Another practice of gardening for resilience is pruning. It's not necessary all the time, but it is a method of trying to support the struggling plants, or the plants that were integrated into the landscape that may have these challenges, such as the 3Ds, which is diseased, damaged, or dying, or dead. And then also if you have crossing branches, or if you're starting with young trees or shrubs, you can do some preliminary pruning at the bottom and train your tree or your shrub in order to get the shape and size, set it up for success in the long run. If you start to prune too late in their development, then you're actually going to create more challenges and more wounds against the plant. Oh, sorry about that. There's another slide right there. So this is the proper pruning. You always want to prune out away from the crotch of the tree, which is also known as the branch collar. And then once you've removed the bulk of the branch, then you can make your final cut. There's a whole pruning class happening March 9th at the gardens if you want to come in and do an actual workshop with us. Gardening with wildlife. So this, I've already said this. Pile branches and earth debris in 3 to 6 foot wide piles, and you can do this further away. And these are, habitat sanctuaries essentially for even the larger animals, such as hares or even overwintering birds, chipmunks, and then that is also a space where those animals can reside and be less noxious to the plants that you're hoping to preserve for the winter in your garden. And remember, it's having these species in your landscape that provide balance. So this insect, or I should say this larva on the top right hand, is actually an instar of a northern spicebush swallowtail. And the swallowtail becomes this beautiful black with this iridescent blue winged butterfly. And this is one of its, this is it in the caterpillar stage, larva stage. Normally you find them green, but I actually came across this one orange. And I had just planted northern spicebush about 2 years before I came across this species. So plant it and they will come. Keep a closed loop system. Use what's on site. It means what I mean. It's all about what I mean right here. Just take advantage of what you have in site, especially your soils and your composting materials. Don't import as much as you possibly can, because the more you import, such as the jumping worm situation or maybe noxious weeds, the more you import rather, the more potential damage can incur. I also recommend, if you can reuse potting soils, And that's great. You have to make sure that your potting soil or your plantings from that previous year's potting soil weren't actually a diseased crop of plants. And that also, if you do have a very dense root system from the remaining roots of the plants before, then break that up a bit, take some of that out and put it into a compost pile, and then put in some rejuvenated fresh material such as your leaf mold or some new compost or even some earth from your garden soil, and mix that up and then make it into a duffy material. It doesn't have to be potting soil in a pot. As long as it has good porosity and organic material. Remember, you need to have some mineralization actually to have good soil structure. And that enables, if you're going to overwinter any plants in some of those larger containers, the mineral soils are even better for that opportunity. So remember to embrace your soils, try to reduce till, as I mentioned, but here is just an example of what a soil rhizosphere is like and how much root webbing there is. And majority of those roots are actually supported by mycorrhiza and mycelium, which are beneficial fungus and bacteria that are really bringing the soil nutrients and making it available for the plant uptake. So not all fungi are bad. If anything, majority of them are really great. The root rhizosphere is a very exciting space for our microorganisms, and we just need to support that. And so the more you till, the more you ruin that. We want to consider permeable solutions, and so if you're doing any pavers or driveways or paths, consider permeable materials. So this is a paver situation and just an illustration of how permeability encourages infiltration, and when we have heavy rains, it reduces the need of stormwater waste water and actually encourages water to be utilized as a perishable and very functional resource. And it also, permeable pavements or permeable solutions enable for roots to really grow within that subsurface without the heaving and of roots wanting to grow upwards towards oxygen. Okay, the reason why so many roots are busting out of pavement or compacted brick walks is because they're going for the oxygen. But if there's good infiltration, there's good oxygen, and the roots will stay beneath. Here are some samples of the material that you could think about for permeable pavements or permeable pavers. And another thing about surfaces is using what you can of natural materials. So have a lot of cross sections of wood around, cut them up and use them for a tiling project on a landscape path. I will say it depends on the type of wood, and they can become a little slippery. So you don't use it as necessarily a primary path, but you can certainly use it as a secondary path. And learn about the woods that are the most rot resistant, okay? And think about materials that you have on site. Like if you are going to take some trees down or branches down, chip them in place. Rent a chipper. Chippers are easy to rent, and make your own chips and then spread them out and make a beautiful woodland path or any kind of path. The picture on the left you may recognize is at the Astaku Garden, and they just use one of their quarried Deer Isle granite stone material, and it just has a nice grit to it and it doesn't slip. It is not permeable. I just want to make sure. The one thing I just wanted to end on is, can you, one person, really make a difference? You are actually not just one person. There's a collective of you. And if we can get this as a community-wide effort throughout the state, throughout the New England, throughout North America, etc., we are going to make an impact. We are going to have we're going to make a dent. And it's really necessary that we start from smallest step. It doesn't have to be all at once, but we certainly want to encourage you to do what you can in the capacity that you can. And if you don't know what that is, hire a consultant to help you out, a landscape gardening consultant. I don't know if I have time, but if you wanted to see this case study in Rockland, I'm happy to share it.
You have time.
Okay. So this is a case study in Rockland at Farnsworth Museum. We ripped out Rosa rugosa, daylilies, and black-eyed Susans, okay? And we also removed some lilacs that were overgrown, and we created some different horizons of the elevations here. There was already a mound on the right-hand side, but we made it into an actual sitting wall, so it encourages people to enjoy the setting, sitting on the wall. And we utilized all native plants in this landscape. So this is all native. It's not necessarily native to Maine. There's a lot of natives to Maine, but there's also a lot of natives to North America. For instance, we can't grow, we don't necessarily have agastache, which is also known as hyssop, garden hyssop. We don't necessarily have that growing native naturally in Maine, but you'll see it in New York, you'll see it in Pennsylvania, etc. And so that is considered a Northeast native. And it grows really well for and attracts our pollinators significantly. So our plants here are magnets to pollinators. Plants, I just want to remind you, plants are not the pollinators. I hear people say, oh yeah, that's a great pollinator. And that's not what we're trying to say, that the plants attract pollinators. So you can say it's a pollinator magnet or a pollinator plant, but it's not a pollinator. So we have iris versicolor and we have seasonal display. So there's from basically May through November, actually December, because we have winterberry in the landscape as well. So there's always something there for either our aesthetic, our visual aesthetic, but also for wildlife. And I will say this is called an urban way station or a pollinator way station in an urban island area. So it's important that even in Belfast, especially in Belfast, just like Rockland, there's so much pavement, there's so much built up land. If you can incorporate more of these gardens and less lawn, you're going to create these pollinator way stations, and that also turn into stormwater runoff management systems. So this was planted, gosh, I think we did it in 2017, 18, and we planted from plugs with the perennials. All the perennials were plugged, and then the shrubs were potted. And I think the largest potted shrub was probably a 10-gallon plant, but we didn't want any balled and burlap. And we used amelanchiers, hay-scented fern, asters, Allegheny sedge. So on the right-hand side is a shady afternoon shade, morning sun, afternoon shade, whereas on the left-hand side, it's afternoon shade, excuse me, morning shade and afternoon sun. So blaring, blazing hot sun, as you can probably see. This is what it looked like when we first started. So instead of making a drip edge, just a straight line, we created a kind of a dry bed stream effect here. Lots of runoff coming off of that aluminum roof. So selecting plants at their initial sizes is something to think about, knowing, okay, do I want a plant maybe larger to begin with if it's a slow grower, or since these are you know, it's young in the spring and it's small, it will have all season long to get big as well. So believe it or not, it's really great to start with small, as I think I've already said, and just be patient. Landscaping for resilience is all about patience. It's not about immediacy. It's not about instantaneousness. So after the June installation, this was an August picture here, the same season. I just noticed that tree is actually, they may have straightened it up. That was an old picture. So that's a pagoda dogwood. It's looking a little lopsided. I hope we straightened it up. I can't remember. Anyways, and then this is just a couple years ago, we did these espalier fruit trees, and we still are working on, you know, training the landscaper on how to sustain the espaliers. They get a little too, if you don't prune them hard every year, once a year, then they get a little out of control. But the grasses beneath them, you can tell this is a September picture because the grasses are in full plume. And this is sand lovegrass. It's a wonderful native grass, Eragrostis spectabilis. It grows on the ditches of our side and shoulders of our roads. It tolerates so much crumb. And just as a reference point here, here's the column when you enter into the back courtyard. Here it is again. This is coming into the courtyard and then walking down here, and now we have a lot of echinacea. The agastache is still there, but what was blooming Amsonia in May and June is now weaning and allowing for the mauve tone to really showcase. So I want to say thank you so much. Just thank you very much for your patience and listening. I hope this was inspiring, and I know I went fast, but this is just a snippet of the material that we teach at the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens. We do have a few classes coming up that are online, and we encourage you. I believe Hillary or Brenda were going to put the web link into the chat box of our mainegardens.org. So if you're interested in looking up some of our classes, we have a lot of them online, but we do have some even now going into March that will be in person. As I said, we have a pruning class in March, and we also have the beginning of a garden design series class, empowering people who have been gardening and who want to just design their own garden or a section of their garden, and how to do that. So we have an 8-part series, and you can register for whatever class you want. It's an individual registration of for each of those 8 classes. You don't have to register for the whole program if you don't feel like you can commit to it, or you feel like you already know a section of the designing process to bypass. We also have an online class on designing with native shrubs, which is probably a great follow-up to this presentation. Thank you again very much.
Well, thank you so much, Irene. That was wonderful. We don't have a ton of questions yet in the chat, so I encourage people to head to the chat to enter their questions. Hillary did ask a question. Is clover native? If not, what is a similar native ground cover?
Red clover is one of our North American natives. It's diverse. It grows all over. It's used as a cover crop. It's not intended to be something that's for permanence. So that's what I was referring to when I mentioned it. But it's great for meadowscaping as well. So it's great for that ground layer and other taller plants to then emerge up through it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I don't have any other. Oh yeah, here comes a question. You referenced arts and crafts gardens and site. What is it?
So it's my play on that is function for form, or form for function, which equals beauty, and that's exactly what the arts and crafts movement was all about. So enhancing plantings for not only their textural beauty, but their functional beauty, and really taking advantage of their sculptural appeal. So you can use plants that have a vase shape and be intentional about what is that vase shape also providing for the landscape overall. Is it a good understory tree to prevent the onset of heavy rains and impacting the soil compaction or preventing soil compaction? Is it protecting other plants at the base of that tree? So that's what I mean by the concept of arts and crafts, is that it takes what the living indoors is like and bringing it outside and enhancing that form for function.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
What was the name of the grass in the borders at the Farnsworth? Sandgrass?
So this photo here, this purpley mauve tone is called sand lovegrass. It's also known as, I can type it into the chat. It's because it's really important to use the botanical name, Eragrostis spectabilis. Sorry, I'm not using capitals there. But yeah, sand lovegrass, and it's or also known as purple lovegrass. And you can see this is the height at which it gets. So it's about an 18-inch high by 2-foot wide grass. And I planted them as little 1-inch plugs. And that's what they became within the next year, honestly. And then the grass on the left-hand side, by the way, over here, where you can see my cursor, is a sedge. It's not actually a grass. And this one is called Carex ebernia. And alternatively, you could use, which grows better in shade, is Carex pennsylvanica. Pennsylvanica. It always wants to correct it to Pennsylvania. It's not Pennsylvania. Pennsylvanica. So those, oh yeah, and it even did that. And it's Ebernia, not Ebernian. Again, sorry. Autocorrect drives me nuts. But these are sedges, and sedges have edges, whereas grasses are typically round in the midrib area. But they are very versatile, and oftentimes you'll see sedges and grasses really cohabitating together, and that's because of their seasonal performances and how they can acclimate to the variety of seasonal weather patterns.
Mhm.
The taller grass, just so you're familiar with that one, over here where my cursor is, that is panicum, that is switchgrass. Right here.
So the next question is, are there examples of horticulture at the botanical gardens?
We're going to, I believe somebody's putting in one this year. Yep. And we're also doing a Three Sisters garden this year. We're working with a Wabanaki group to implement a beautiful display of the Three Sisters garden. And if you're not familiar with that, permaculture, by the way, is a really great design approach for designing for resilience. It can get a little messy and some people don't like it, but if you really learn and study plant behavior and style and habits, then it can be a beautifully aesthetic setting experience as well. But the Three Sisters is kind of like the beginning stages of what permaculture really incorporates, and it's utilizing plant forms for function as well, but their seasonal performances. So the corn stalk is basically the trellis or the lattice, and then you have the beans going up that, and then the base of covering the soil and supporting the soil are the cucurbits or the squashes.
Oh, nice. So there's a question, a woman says, I'd like to reduce my lawn and move to wildflowers. Would you suggest doing that by sheet mulching and then seeding or using plugs?
So it will depend on how big your lawn is. I actually think sheet mulching is not necessarily as ideal if you're doing a really vast area, because then you would need a lot of material to go over that sheet mulching. I would pick sections of your property in maybe like a 3-year term and start making that effort of converting. So maybe it's either through the sheet mulching in a section 1 year, and then you sheet mulch again the next year, so etc. And then you can sow directly into that compost layer on top of the sheet mulching. Or you can mow, if your lawn is really crummy to begin with and it's mostly crabgrass, mow it down as low as you possibly can, and that's in the late season into October, November, and then do a dormant seed, and then the following season see what germinates, and then start plugging in plug plants if you want to as well. But don't take it all in one fell swoop, because you won't be able to irrigate it enough if it's a big space, and it's just going to be overwhelming. So do it in sections if you can.
So I'm going to ask a dumb question.
Brenda, you're a librarian. You know there's no such thing as
well,
dumb
you're
questions.
using this term planting plugs, and so I'm thinking, okay, that's
I apologize. So plugs are basically little cells.
yeah.
So you have a tray. You know how you start your veggies in a tray?
Yeah.
Those little cells are also known as plugs.
Right.
So if you take a perennial into that same capacity as like a vegetable, and you just plant, we're calling them the plug form, which is basically a 1-inch to a 2-inch size root ball, then you're planting that into the garden.
Yeah, and if you can reduce the use of plastic in houses, that's what I was kind of getting at. Like,
yeah, definitely.
because there's
Definitely.
so much plastic. in
Yep.
green.
Yeah, and if you're even really good at it, you can get those soil blockers, soil
Mhm.
block makers, and then just do air pruning, and you can sow into those and not even use plastic pots.
Yep, I remember those. Does anybody else have a question? I'm not seeing one. You can unmute.
Okay.
What?
I said okay. That's all.
Did somebody, you can unmute yourselves if you have a question also. Guess they're all writing down notes still.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, and I hope we can see you at the gardens this summer. We do open up officially May 1st, but we hope that you can be interested in some of our classes. Again, coming from down East Maine or Mid Coast Maine, it may be harder. So we have a lot of online classes to bait you in, as I like to say.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Irene. I really appreciate the talk. And yeah, I'm
Yeah,
gonna
thank you, Irene. It was really interesting. Thank you.
You're very welcome.